Okay, so continuing on our readings for the factors of awakening, the seven Bojjhangas, as a part of the fourth foundation of mindfulness. And my reading today is from a book of Ajahn Geoff. Of course, he has a book on factors for awakening. So this is a talk, this looks like one of the talks he gave before his regular evening pujas and meditation. And it's titled Factors for Awakening. It was given September 26, 2009. Several years back, I was asked to give a talk on the factors for awakening. Mindfulness, analysis of qualities, persistence, rapture, calm, concentration, and equanimity. And it turned out that the people who'd organized the event had asked for that topic under the impression that the factors for awakening were a description of the awakened mind, the goal toward which we were aiming, whereas they're actually a path leading to awakening. Part of the misunderstanding was based on the question of how to translate the Pali term Bojjhanga, awakening factors. Because it's a compound, it could be factors of awakening, but if you actually look at how these factors are explained in the text, the meaning of the term is very much factors for awakening. These are qualities of mind you develop in order to become awakened. You can't take awakening and develop it. You can't clone the awakened state. But you can work on developing everyday factors of the mind that eventually will lead to awakening. This is one of the important aspects of the Buddhist teaching. The path to awakening is built out of very ordinary day-to-day things, like mindfulness and alertness. It's simply that when you learn how to look at them in a new way, to analyze them in a new way, and to develop and use them in a new way, they can take you all the way to awakening. This is especially important when you try to understand the second factor for awakening, analysis of qualities, which is the heart of the sect. As the people who had arranged that event said, their impression of this factor was that in the awakened mind, everything is just mental qualities arising, passing away, with a great lightness. You see these things coming and going, and they don't weigh on the mind anymore, which is a stage of the path, but to look at the factor in that way misses out on a very useful aspect of what it's all about. When the Buddha talks about developing that factor, he says it's a matter of paying appropriate attention to what's skillful and what's not. And then, based on that factor, you develop the next factor, which is persistence in actually developing what's skillful and abandoning what's not. So instead of trying to clone yourself into a very rarefied state, the Buddha is asking you to look very carefully at what you're doing. You apply appropriate attention to what you're doing in body, speech, and mind, but especially mind, to see how skillful your actions are. We often describe appropriate attention as looking at things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. But that level of appropriate attention builds on another level of appropriate attention, which is simply seeing what's skillful and unskillful in your actions, judging your actions by the results they yield. This involves questioning. It's not simply a matter of conviction, although the simple fact that you're going to follow this path of looking at what's skillful and unskillful requires that you be convinced that the Buddha knew what he was talking about. That, and conviction that there are wise people who've been trained in this path and who know what they're talking about too. Because when the Buddha asks you to look at what's skillful and unskillful in general terms, as when he's talking to the Kalamas, he says that it's not simply a matter of judging things in terms of your own experience and your own standards. It also involves taking into account the teachings of the wise, people whose behavior you've looked at carefully and whom you've learned to trust. As the Buddha shows in his instructions to Rahula, you don't just look at your own actions and then come to conclusions about them. If you find that you've made a mistake or done something harmful, you go talk to somebody else who's more advanced and on the path. In other words, you seek the counsel of the wise. So it's a matter partly of looking for yourself and partly of taking into account the advice you get from wise people who have more experience on the path than you do. Now, you recognize wise people by using your own powers of judgment as honestly as you can. So in the ultimate analysis, appropriate attention does come down to your willingness to look at actions, to see where they're causing suffering, and to ask yourself questions. Okay, where is this suffering? Exactly what am I stressed out about? Do wise people do these sorts of things too? You may have some general knowledge on the basic principle that stress comes from craving and clinging, but the Buddha wants you to go beyond general principles. He wants you to see specific things arising and passing away. When does the stress come? When does it get intensified? When does it weaken? What else happens in the mind at the same time that it's intensifying? What else is happening at the same time it's weakening? That's applying appropriate attention. Now, to do this, of course, you need to develop the other factors for awakening, starting with mindfulness. Mindfulness, in the Buddhist sense of the term, means keeping something in mind. Right mindfulness means keeping in mind your resolve to stay with the body, or with feelings, or with mind states, or with mental qualities, in and of themselves, as your primary frame of reference, at the same time that you put aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The word primary here is important, because there's no way you're going to be focused on the body without noticing feelings or mind states or mental qualities. After all, they all come together right here. This is why the Buddha says that you can focus on any of the four and follow it all the way to awakening. You choose one of them as being primary, and then you relate the other three to that primary focus. For instance, right now we're with the breath, which is the frame of reference that the Buddha recommends most specifically for dealing with all four frames. When feelings come up, relate them to the breath. How does the breath affect the feelings? How do the feelings affect the way you breathe? For instance, if there's a pain in your body, do you tend to breathe in a way that walls off the pain so that it doesn't spread? We often have a sense of the breath spreading, but we don't like the idea of pain spreading. So we tense up around it so that it doesn't spread along with the breath. If you find yourself doing that subconsciously, ask yourself, what if I deliberately think of the breath going through the pain? Can I open up that part of the body? In this way, you keep the breath as primary, and then the pain becomes secondary, simply related to the breath. The same principle applies to mind states. Certain mind states are fostered by tense or constricted breathing. Other more skillful states are fostered by a sense of breath that flows thoroughly throughout the body, refreshing the body. You want to notice that and take advantage of it. Now notice, we're not simply staying with the breath or feelings or mind states simply as they are. We're trying to do something skillful with them. This counts as the quality of ardency that, as part of right mindfulness, the Buddha also has you keep in mind. If you see that a certain way of breathing, a certain feeling, or a certain mind state is leading to unskillful thoughts, words, or deeds, change it. If any of these things lead to skillful thoughts, words, and deeds, you maintain them and try to develop them. It's not that these tools we develop as part of right mindfulness are for use only while we're here sitting with our eyes closed. They're meant to be used throughout the day. Somebody says something and you notice a catch in the breath. You can take that as a warning sign that something's going on in the mind as well. You've reacted to what that person has said. And if you have the time, you want to look into it. If you don't have time, just make a mental note and then try to breathe through whatever tension has developed in the breath so that you're not carrying that little bit of tension around with you for the rest of the day. Otherwise, it acts like a magnet. It attracts other little bits and pieces of tension until you've got a huge armor or a huge cluster of tension that's invaded the body. And then there's the problem of how to get it out. Whereas it's a lot easier if we begin to notice the little pieces as they form, and you can breathe right through them to make them dissolve away. That's the function of what the Buddha calls mindfulness as a governing principle. As you're anchored with the breath in the present moment, you make good things come and stay. You make bad things go. This puts you in a better position to look at the mind. Again, your basic foundation is the breath, and you watch the mind from the position of a very comfortable, very refreshing, very fulfilling way of breathing. You see the mind in a very different light than if you were looking at it from a feeling of being all tensed, tight, and wound up. So that's mindfulness. As you practice mindfulness in this way, you're already beginning to develop analysis of qualities, seeing which mind states or which breath states or breath patterns are skillful and which ones are not. And you learn how to foster the skillful ones. This is another area where conviction comes in. As the Buddha says, if it weren't possible to develop skillful qualities and to abandon unskillful ones, he wouldn't have taught people to do that. If it weren't the case that you would benefit from developing skillful ones and abandoning unskillful ones, he wouldn't have taught that either. And you need to have conviction that he knows what he's talking about. But this factor of analysis of qualities is very much a path factor, not a factor to arrive at. It's what enables you to see what needs to be done. Then, based on that, you develop the factor of persistence, which is the same as the ardency in right mindfulness, and the same as right effort. And to encourage persistence, it's good to develop heedfulness, realizing that you really do need to develop skillful qualities now. You can't wait until tomorrow or next week or next month or next year. You need to do this now. After all, you could die at any moment. Not just physical death. Your goodness could die at any moment. Something could come up, either a thought about something that someone has done or said, or an actual event right here, right now, that could catch you off guard, and you could do or say things that are really harmful. That can happen at any time. So you have to be careful. You have to be heedful all the time. When you're heedful like this, the other factors for awakening come in. The factors that show how mindfulness and discernment, the first two factors, lead to concentration. There's the rapture that comes as the mind gets more and more full, as your sense of the breath energy gets more and more full. You're not wounding it with unskillful thoughts, unskillful attitudes, or unskillful ways of breathing. So its fullness can grow. From that, there's calm. From calm, there's concentration. And when the mind is concentrated and calm, it can look at things with a more solid sense of equanimity. As the Buddha said, there are levels of equanimity. The lowest level is what he calls an equanimity based on diversity. You simply make up your mind that whatever comes up in terms of sight, sound, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, or ideas, you're going to try to stay non-reactive. That kind of equanimity can be maintained as long as you maintain your mindfulness, and your will to be non-reactive. A lot stronger, though, is the equanimity that the Buddha says is based on unification. That is, when the mind really settles down and is one. With that sense of calm, well-being, and fullness, you feel less touched by events because you've got something much better to feed on. You're not going out nibbling off other people's words or gulping down sensual pleasures because you've got something much better right there. It's not simply a matter of willing yourself not to react. You don't feel any need to react. So, but we're not practicing these things just to arrive at equanimity. There's another problem with seeing the awakening factors as a map of the enlightened mind. Many people think, well, all you need to do is arrive at equanimity and there you are, Nibbana. But that's not the case. Nibbana is not the ultimate equanimity. It's the ultimate happiness. Equanimity is part of the path. You gain equanimity toward all things that are not important in life so that you can keep analyzing that issue of what's skillful and unskillful in the mind, and can do that analysis with more subtlety and precision. That's what equanimity is for. What the Buddha is doing is putting you in a position where your happiness depends more and more on one thing, the good qualities of the mind as it's trained. You then use this sense of well-being to pry away your attachments to other things. Because you can see, when you do this sort of action, bodily or verbal, you get these results. When you foster this quality of mind, you get these results. When you foster that quality of mind, you get other kinds of results. You get more and more sensitive to where there's stress. Then you know what to do to get rid of that stress. Again, you have to look at the particulars so that you can apply a precise solution. This is why analysis of qualities is the central factor here. You're looking at events. The word Dhamma, qualities, can also mean events or actions. And here we're particularly looking at mental actions. Look at your actions and see what you're doing, where there's stress, what you did to aggravate that stress, what you could do to undercut it. That is, how you abandon the cause. You follow these questions all the way to the questions about wherever there's anything that's inconstant, it's stressful. Wherever there's anything that's stressful, it's to be regarded as not self, something to let go, let go, let go. But all of these qualities working together are needed to take you to awakening. If you try to do the letting go without having developed concentration, the insights can get very dry and very alienating. I've heard of people letting go of their sense of self prematurely and getting very disoriented as a result. They think, wow, I've let go of my sense of self, so it must be awakening. But it's not. It's destabilizing. They've cut away all the tools they need in order to stay on the path. After all, you do need a sense of self to function on the path. A wise sense of self, a skillful sense of self, which you've been developing as part of the path. You let it go only when you don't need it anymore. And part of that sense of self is the state of well-being that comes when you get the mind into good, strong concentration. So all these factors are needed, but it's important to remember that they are a path. You're not trying to clone awakening. You're not trying to will the mind into some expansive, unconditioned state. The path to awakening is followed in little tiny incremental steps, looking at each of your actions and every instance of stress as it comes up. The more precisely you can see these things, the more clearly you can see exactly where you're causing suffering and how you can stop. Seek the counsel of the wise when you need it, but otherwise stay focused right here on the particulars. It's through the particulars that you break through to a state that's totally unlimited and not defined in any way at all. It's called freedom because in reaching that state, we are freed from our defilements. In other words, it's called freedom as a comparison, but in and of itself, it can't properly be described. That's a sign of how special it is. Questions, comments?
The
Yes.
word tamayata,
Yes?
does that fit anywhere in with these factors?
Fits everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, in that sense of atamiyata, it's like this, or it's made of this, or not made of this. Just sort of pointing to reality, but it's a way of not. That's why it says that the focus on the skillful and the unskillful is so important, because you can get too wrapped up in the idea of, okay, I've got to make my mind into this ultimate concept of atamiyata. Good to be back, just get down on the ground again.
Is it correct to view that equanimity based on diversity is something to cultivate through daily life as we're going about normal things, and then equanimity based on unity is more of a fourth jhana kind of state, that the former supports the development of the latter?
In theory, yes. But then also, as there is more skill and more experience, then the actual equanimity based on unity starts to translate into everything as well.
So they support each other.
Yeah. Okay. My next reading is Samyutta 46, Sutta number 1, the mountain. And this is the first sutta in the Bojjhanga collection. And as is often the case, in the very first sutta of most collections, whether it's like a Samyutta Nikaya or Majjhima Nikaya or whatever, or even within the collections of each, there tends to be an extremely important principle being pointed to start things off. So this, I feel, is an important principle that's being pointed to. So this is at Savatthi. Bhikkhus, based upon the Himalayas, the king of mountains, the Nagas nurture their bodies and acquire strength. When they have nurtured their bodies and acquired strength, they then enter the pools. From the pools they enter the lakes, then the streams, then the rivers, and finally they enter the ocean. There they achieve greatness and expansiveness of body. So too, bhikkhus, based upon virtue, established upon virtue, a bhikkhu develops and cultivates the 7 factors of enlightenment. And thereby he achieves greatness and expansiveness in wholesome states. And how does a bhikkhu, based upon virtue, established upon virtue, develop the 7 factors of enlightenment? Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu develops the enlightenment factor of mindfulness, which is based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. Develops the enlightenment factor of discrimination of states, the enlightenment factor of energy, the enlightenment factor of rapture, the enlightenment factor of tranquility, the enlightenment factor of concentration, the enlightenment factor of equanimity, which is based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. It is in this way, bhikkhus, that a bhikkhu, based upon virtue, established upon virtue, develops the 7 factors of enlightenment, and thereby achieves greatness and expansiveness in wholesome states. That's quite straightforward, but I think it's important to see especially in light of Ajahn Geoff's distinction that these are enlightenment factors for enlightenment, as opposed to a description of an enlightened state, and so that these factors that are supportive for the awakened heart and awakening process are based upon virtue, established in virtue. It has to be that foundation and seed of integrity is so important. And also then, just as we brought up yesterday, each of the factors then also has their supporting conditions. Seclusion, dispassion, cessation, relinquishment. That is an essential piece of the cultivation and development of these factors of awakening. Okay. Next sutta that I want to read is from Majjhima Nikaya 2, Sambhasava Sutta. It's one of my favorite suttas, and usually don't pass up an opportunity to read it if I can. But it also has some factors of awakening mentioned in it as well. Okay, thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jaitis Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied. The Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, I shall teach you a discourse on the restraint of all the taints. So that's the asava, sambhasava. So the taints, outflows, effluents, inflows. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, Venerable Sir, the bhikkhus replied. The Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, I say that the destruction of the taints is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know and see. Who knows and sees what? Wise attention and unwise attention. When one attends unwisely, unarisen taints arise and arisen taints increase. When one attends wisely, unarisen taints do not arise and arisen taints are abandoned. Because there are taints that should be abandoned by seeing. There are taints that should be abandoned by restraining. There are taints that should be abandoned by using. There are taints that should be abandoned by enduring. There are taints that should be abandoned by avoiding. There are taints that should be abandoned by removing. There are taints that should be abandoned by developing. What taints, bhikkhus, should be abandoned by seeing? Here, bhikkhus, an untaught, ordinary person who has no regard for noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for true men and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, does not understand what things are fit for attention and what things are unfit for attention. Since that is so, he attends to those things unfit for attention and he does not attend to those things fit for attention. What are the things unfit for attention that he attends to? They are things such that when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire arises in him, and the arisen taint of sensual desire increases. The unarisen taint of being arises in him, and the arisen taint of being increases. The unarisen taint of ignorance arises in him, and the arisen taint of ignorance increases. These are the things unfit for attention that he attends to. And what are the things that fit for attention that he does not attend to? They are things such that when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire does not arise in him, and the arisen taint of sensual desire is abandoned. The unarisen taint of being does not arise in him, and the arisen taint of being is abandoned. The unarisen taint of ignorance does not arise in him, and the arisen taint of ignorance is abandoned. These are the things fit for attention that he does not attend to. By attending to things unfit for attention, by not attending to things fit for attention, both unarisen taints arise in him and arisen taints increase. This is how he attends unwisely. Was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Having been what did I become in the past? Shall I be in the future? Shall I not be in the future? What shall I be in the future? How shall I be in the future? Having been what shall I become in the future? Or else he is inwardly perplexed about the present thus. Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? Where is this being come from? Where will it go? When he attends unwisely in this way, one of 6 views arises in him. The view, self exists for me, arises in him as true and established. Or the view no self exists for me, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive self with self, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive not self with self, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive self with not self, arises in him as true and established. Or else he has some such view as this: it is this self of mine that speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions, but this self of mine is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change, and it will endure as long as eternity. This speculative view, bhikkhus, is called the thicket of views, the wilderness of views, the contortion of views, the vacillation of views, the fetter of views. Fettered by the fetter of views, the untaught ordinary person is not freed from birth, aging, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. He is not freed from suffering, I say. Bhikkhus, a well-taught noble disciple who has regard for noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, who has regard for true men and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, understands what things are fit for attention and what things are unfit for attention. Since that is so, he does not attend to those things unfit for attention, and he attends to those things fit for attention. What are the things unfit for attention that he does not attend to? They are things such that when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire rises in him, and so on and so forth, and the arisen taint of ignorance increases. These are the things unfit for attention that he does not attend to. And what are the things fit for attention that he attends to? They are the things such that when he attends to them, unarisen taint of sensual desire does not arise, arisen taint of ignorance is abandoned. These are the things fit for attention. By not attending to things unfit for attention, and by attending to things fit for attention, unarisen unarisen taints do not arise in him, and arisen taints are abandoned. He attends wisely. This is suffering. He attends wisely. This is the origin of suffering. He attends wisely. This is the cessation of suffering. He attends wisely. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. When he attends wisely in this way, 3 fetters are abandoned: personality view, doubt, and adherence to rules and observances. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by seeing. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by restraining? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, abides with the eye faculty restrained. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who abides with the eye faculty unrestrained, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who abides with the eye faculty restrained. Reflecting wisely abides with the ear faculty restrained, with the nose faculty restrained, with the tongue faculty restrained, with the body faculty restrained, with the mind faculty restrained. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who abides with the faculties unrestrained, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who abides with the faculties restrained. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by restraining. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by using? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, uses the robe only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun and creeping things, and only for the purpose of concealing the private parts. Reflecting wisely, he uses alms food, neither for amusement, nor for intoxication, nor for the sake of physical beauty and attractiveness, but only for the endurance and continuance of this body, for ending discomfort, and for assisting the holy life, considering. Thus I shall terminate old feelings without arising new feelings, and I shall be healthy and blameless, and shall live in comfort. Reflecting wisely, he uses the resting place only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things, and only for the purpose of warding off the perils of climate and for enjoying retreat. Reflecting wisely, he uses the medicinal requisites only for protection from arisen afflicting feelings and for the benefit of good health. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not use the requisites thus, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who uses them thus. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by using. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by enduring? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, bears cold and heat, hunger and thirst, in contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things. He endures ill-spoken, unwelcome words and arisen bodily feelings that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, and menacing to life. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not endure such things, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who endures them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by enduring. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by avoiding? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, avoids a wild elephant, a wild horse, a wild bull, a wild dog, a snake, a stump, a bramble patch, a chasm, a cliff, a cesspit, a sewer. Reflecting wisely, he avoids sitting on unsuitable seats, wandering to unsuitable resorts, and associating with bad friends, since if he were to do so, wise companions in the holy life might suspect him of evil conduct. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not avoid these things, there are no taints, vexation, and fever in one who avoids them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by removing? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. He abandons it, removes it, does away with it, annihilates it. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will, does not tolerate an arisen thought of cruelty. He does not tolerate arisen evil, unwholesome states. He abandons them, removes them, does away with them, and annihilates them. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not remove these thoughts, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who removes them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by removing. What taints bhikkhus should be abandoned by developing? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, develops the mindfulness enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, and ripens in relinquishment. He develops the investigation of states enlightenment factor, the energy enlightenment factor, the rapture enlightenment factor, the tranquility enlightenment factor, the concentration enlightenment factor, the equanimity enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, and ripens in relinquishment. While taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not develop these enlightenment factors, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who develops them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by developing. Because when for a bhikkhu, the taints that should be abandoned by seeing have been abandoned by seeing, when the taints that should be abandoned by restraining have been abandoned by restraining, when the taints that should be abandoned by using have been abandoned by using, when the taints that should be abandoned by enduring have been abandoned by enduring, when the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding have been abandoned by avoiding, when the taints that should be abandoned by removing have been abandoned by removing, when the taints that should be abandoned by developing have been abandoned by developing, then he is called a bhikkhu who dwells restrained with the restraint of all the taints. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, he has made an end of suffering. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. Questions, comments?
Do you have a quick version of that one, Paul?
Yeah, just breathe in, breathe out mindfully.
Refrain from evil, purify the mind.
Yes, yeah.
The evil abuse, the bramble abuse,
Yeah.
I like that part. What was I in the past? What was I doing?
Yes, it feels very familiar. Okay.